On the evening of July 4, 1942, convoy PQ-17 was steaming through the Arctic Ocean toward the Soviet port of Archangel, carrying cargo that Stalin's armies desperately needed to resist the German invasion. The convoy consisted of 35 merchant ships loaded with nearly 200,000 tons of war material, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, everything required to sustain modern warfare. Escorting these merchant vessels were destroyers, corvettes, anti-aircraft ships, submarines, and minesweepers, a protective screen that represented one of the largest concentrations of Allied naval power in Arctic waters. The journey from Iceland to Russia was always dangerous. German U-boats, aircraft, and surface ships operated freely in these latitudes, but PQ-17 had every reason for confidence. Earlier convoys had fought through with acceptable losses. Intelligence suggested that German battleships were not immediately threatening. The Admiralty had provided strong escorts and was monitoring the situation continuously. Then, at 9:36 in the evening, the escort commander received a signal from London that would transform a difficult but manageable operation into the greatest naval disaster of the Arctic convoys. The message was brief and unambiguous. Convoy is to scatter. What followed was slaughter. Over the next 10 days, as merchant ships dispersed across hundreds of miles of Arctic Ocean and attempted to reach Russia alone, German submarines and aircraft hunted them systematically. 24 ships were sunk, representing 2/3 of the convoy. 153 merchant seamen died in the freezing waters. 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, 3,350 vehicles, and 99,000 tons of other cargo went to the bottom. The losses were staggering, but the manner in which they occurred, not through overwhelming enemy force, but through an order that stripped the convoy of its protection, made the disaster particularly bitter. The men who died in PQ-17 were killed not by German efficiency, but by British panic, by a command decision that prioritized theoretical threats over operational reality. The strategic context of the Arctic convoys was rooted in the desperate circumstances of summer 1942. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union a year earlier, and by July the Wehrmacht was driving toward the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad. Soviet resistance was fierce but costly, consuming material faster than Soviet factories could produce replacements. Stalin demanded that Britain and the United States open a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army. Churchill and Roosevelt, not yet ready for a cross-channel invasion, offered instead a flow of weapons and supplies delivered by convoy through the Arctic Ocean to Soviet ports. These Arctic convoys became politically and strategically essential, a visible demonstration of Allied commitment that Stalin accepted as insufficient but better than nothing. The route itself was a navigator's nightmare and a commander's fear. Convoys departed from Iceland or Scotland, traveled north around Norway's North Cape, and entered the Barents Sea before reaching Murmansk or Archangel. In summer, the midnight sun eliminated darkness, making concealment impossible and allowing German aircraft to attack around the clock. In winter, darkness and storms provided some protection but created hazards of ice, cold, and navigation that killed ships without enemy action. The waters were shallow in places, limiting submarine maneuvers but also restricting the movements of escort vessels. German forces operated from Norwegian bases, giving them short distances to target areas and allowing rapid concentration of U-boats and aircraft against detected convoys. Convoy PQ-17 sailed from Iceland on June 27th with 35 merchant ships and an escort that seemed adequate to the threat. The close escort consisted of destroyers, corvettes, and smaller anti-submarine vessels that would accompany the merchants throughout the journey. A covering force of cruisers under Rear Admiral Lewis Hamilton steamed nearby, ready to intervene if German surface ships appeared. Further distant, the home fleet with battleships and an aircraft carrier provided heavy backup, though it would remain west of Bear Island to avoid German air attacks from Norway. The layered defense was designed to protect against U-boats, aircraft, and surface raiders simultaneously, trading flexibility for comprehensive coverage. The first days of the passage proceeded with the expected harassment. German reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoy continuously, reporting positions that allowed U-boats and bombers to be vectored toward the formation. Aircraft attacked several times, but were driven off by anti-aircraft fire. One merchant ship was torpedoed and sank. One more was damaged and had to return to Iceland. The losses were regrettable, but within predictions. The convoy continued eastward, its formation tight, its escorts alert, moving steadily through waters that grew more dangerous with every mile toward Norway. The crisis that destroyed PQ-17 began with intelligence rather than combat. British codebreakers monitoring German communications detected signals suggesting that the battleship Tirpitz, Germany's most powerful surface ship, was preparing to sortie from her Norwegian fjord. Tirpitz was a monster, 45,000 tons, 8 15-inch guns, armor that could resist conventional torpedo attacks. If she emerged to attack PQ-17, the convoy's escorts would be helpless. Destroyers and corvettes could not engage a battleship with any hope of success. The covering force of cruisers might delay her, but could not stop her. Only the home fleet battleships could fight Tirpitz on equal terms, and they were too far away to intervene quickly. The Admiralty's response to this perceived threat was shaped by institutional trauma from earlier disasters. The loss of HMS Hood to Bismarck 1 year earlier had demonstrated what German battleships could accomplish against inadequate opposition. The destruction of Force Zand by Japanese aircraft off Malaya had shown that capital ships without air cover were vulnerable. The memory of these failures influenced decision-making at the highest levels, creating a culture of caution that prioritized avoiding catastrophic loss over accepting operational risk. When intelligence suggested Tirpitz might attack PQ-17, the Admiralty's first instinct was not to fight, but to disperse, to deny the Germans a concentrated target, to sacrifice individual merchant ships rather than risk losing entire escort forces. Admiral Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord, made the decision personally. He was 65 years old, exhausted by 3 years of war, suffering from a brain tumor that would kill him within months, though he did not know it. His judgment was clouded by fatigue and illness, his thinking influenced by worst-case scenarios that seemed more plausible than they were. Intelligence reports were ambiguous about Tirpitz's actual movements. She had moved to a forward anchorage but had not sailed. Yet Pound interpreted them as confirmation that attack was imminent. He overruled subordinates who urged caution, ignored the assessment of the officer commanding the cruiser force who reported no contact with enemy surface ships, and issued the scatter order based on his belief that Tirpitz was already at sea. The signal that reached Rear Admiral Hamilton aboard HMS London at 9:36 on the evening of July 4th contained 3 separate messages, each escalating in urgency. The first ordered the covering cruisers to withdraw at high speed westward, away from the convoy. The second ordered the close escorts to withdraw as well, leaving the merchant ships without protection. The third ordered the convoy itself to scatter, with individual ships proceeding independently toward Russia. The cumulative effect of these orders was to strip PQ-17 of every defensive asset simultaneously, based on a threat that did not exist. Hamilton, receiving these orders, was stunned. He could see nothing that justified such drastic action. His cruisers had detected no surface contacts. Submarine and aircraft attacks had been routine, not indicative of imminent catastrophe. The convoy was maintaining formation and making steady progress. Scattering would expose merchant ships to exactly the attacks they had so far successfully resisted. He queried the Admiralty for clarification, received confirmation that the orders were to be executed immediately, and reluctantly complied. The cruisers turned west. The destroyers followed. The merchant ships, left alone in hostile waters, began to disperse. The transformation from organized convoy to scattered individuals was chaotic and demoralizing. Merchant captains, trained to follow escort instructions, suddenly found themselves without guidance or protection. Some ships headed directly for Russian ports, taking the shortest route despite the dangers. Others attempted to hide along the edge of the polar ice, hoping to evade detection until the threat passed. Still others reversed course, thinking withdrawal to Iceland was the only safe option. The scattering destroyed the mutual protection that convoys provided: concentrated anti-aircraft fire, coordinated maneuvering, shared lookouts, and replaced it with isolation. Each ship became its own target, unable to defend itself, unable to help others, visible to German reconnaissance aircraft that now tracked dozens of separate vessels instead of one compact formation. The German reaction to the scatter was initially confused, then opportunistic. U-boat commanders, expecting to attack a defended convoy, suddenly found merchant ships traveling alone and unprotected. Aircraft that would have faced massed anti-aircraft fire now engaged individual ships with impunity. The Luftwaffe units stationed in northern Norway, equipped with Heinkel bombers and Junkers dive bombers, launched continuous attacks. They sank ships with bombs, torpedoes, and strafing runs. They hit vessels carrying ammunition, creating explosions that destroyed the ships instantly. They hit tankers, leaving burning slicks of fuel oil that spread across cold water. They hunted systematically, vectored by reconnaissance aircraft toward each new target, achieving success rates that exceeded their most optimistic predictions. The submarines were equally lethal. German U-boats operating in the Barents Sea had been repositioned to intercept PQ-17 before the scatter, but the convoy's defensive screen had made attacks difficult. After the scatter, submarines found targets everywhere, often closer together than their own positions, creating what submariners call a target-rich environment. Commanders who might normally expend days stalking a single convoy could sink multiple ships in hours. Torpedo attacks came from periscope depth, sometimes from surface positions when visibility was poor and the isolated merchants could not flee. Ships that survived one attack often encountered another submarine or aircraft before they could reach safety. The experiences of individual merchant ships during this ordeal reveal the human cost of the Admiralty's decision. The SS Paulus Potter, a Dutch freighter carrying aircraft and vehicles, was attacked by dive bombers on July 5th. Hit multiple times, she began to sink. Her crew abandoned ship in lifeboats and watched their vessel disappear beneath the Arctic waves. They rowed toward the Russian coast, hoping to reach land before exposure killed them. Days later, exhausted and hypothermic, they were rescued by a Soviet patrol boat. Other crews were less fortunate. The SS River Afton was torpedoed and sank within minutes, taking most of her crew with her. The survivors who made it to lifeboats faced Arctic waters where survival time was measured in minutes without immersion suits. Many died of hypothermia before rescue could arrive. The psychological trauma inflicted by the scatter order was as significant as the physical losses. Merchant seamen, who had volunteered for hazardous duty and accepted the risks of convoy operations, felt abandoned by the Navy that was supposed to protect them. The destroyers and corvettes steaming away at high speed, following orders that made no sense to those being left behind, created images that survivors would remember with bitterness for the rest of their lives. The implicit contract of naval warfare that escorts would defend merchants in exchange for merchants accepting the risks of military cargo had been violated. Trust, once broken, was difficult to restore. The irony that makes PQ-17 particularly tragic is that Tirpitz never attacked. The battleship remained in her Norwegian fjord throughout the period when PQ-17 was being destroyed. German naval commanders had considered sortie operations, but decided against them, judging the risks too great given British Home Fleet strength and the availability of aircraft and submarines to accomplish the same objectives with less exposure. The threat that Pound feared, the disaster he scattered the convoy to avoid, was imaginary. His decision was not merely wrong in hindsight, it was wrong at the time, based on incomplete intelligence and worst-case assumptions that operational commanders on scene did not share. The aftermath of PQ-17 brought recriminations that would last for decades. Churchill, learning of the disaster, was horrified by the losses and concerned about the political implications. Stalin would use the catastrophe to criticize Allied commitment to the Soviet cause, arguing that if Britain could not protect convoys, the Second Front was even more urgent. The Admiralty conducted investigations that largely exonerated Pound. The official narrative emphasized the intelligence about Tirpitz and minimized the judgment errors that had led to the scatter order. Escort commanders who had questioned the decision were not vindicated during Pound's lifetime. Only after his death in October 1943 did the full extent of the blunder become public knowledge. The merchant mariners who survived PQ-17 received compensation in the form of medals and commendations, official recognition that acknowledged their suffering without admitting the institutional failure that had caused it. Some returned to sea carrying war cargo on subsequent convoys that benefited from lessons learned through catastrophe. Others left the merchant marine, unable or unwilling to accept further risks after experiencing abandonment in Arctic waters. The psychological casualties, men whose minds broke under the stress of watching their ships burn, of seeing shipmates die, of enduring days in lifeboats without hope of rescue, were never fully counted. The operational lessons of PQ-17 influenced convoy doctrine for the remainder of the war. The primary conclusion was that convoys should never be scattered unless enemy surface forces were actually present and engaging. Theoretical threats, no matter how plausible, did not justify exposing merchants to known dangers of submarines and aircraft. Escort forces were instructed to maintain protection until certain of overwhelming enemy strength, trusting that concentrated defensive fire and evasive maneuvers offered better survival odds than dispersion. The home fleet battleships were positioned more aggressively in support of Arctic convoys, accepting higher risk to provide more effective deterrence against German surface ships. The impact on Arctic convoy operations was immediate and severe. PQ-18, the next major convoy to Russia, did not sail until September 1942, 2 months after PQ-17. When it did sail, it carried the largest escort force ever assigned to an Arctic convoy, including an escort carrier providing air cover throughout the journey. The convoy fought through intense attacks, losing 13 of 40 ships but destroying numerous German aircraft and demonstrating that defended convoys could survive even concentrated assault. The contrast with PQ-17 was obvious. PQ-18's losses, though heavy, were suffered in combat rather than through abandonment. The tactical performance of German forces against the scattered PQ-17 ships revealed both the effectiveness of coordinated air-sea operations and the limitations imposed by Arctic geography. Luftwaffe and U-boat commanders cooperated more effectively than in most theaters, sharing reconnaissance information and coordinating attacks to maximize sinkings. But the same weather that aided German operations by providing continuous daylight also created difficulties. Fog banks allowed some merchants to hide until threats passed. Ice fields provided navigational hazards that protected vulnerable ships from pursuit. The sheer distances involved meant that even after the scatter, some ships reached Russian ports simply because German forces could not intercept everything simultaneously. The Soviet reception of PQ-17 survivors was complicated by political and strategic considerations. Stalin's government was grateful for military supplies, but suspicious of Western motives and critical of what it perceived as insufficient commitment. Merchant crews who reached Russian ports expecting gratitude sometimes encountered indifference or hostility. Soviet authorities were more interested in the cargo than the men who had risked their lives delivering it. Cultural and linguistic barriers made communication difficult. The dreary ports of Murmansk and Archangel, under constant German air attack, offered little respite after the ordeal of the convoy journey. Survivors often found that reaching safety meant merely exchanging one form of danger for another. The long-term strategic impact of PQ-17 extended beyond immediate military consequences. The disaster demonstrated the vulnerability of Arctic convoys and forced a reassessment of the cost-benefit calculation. Was maintaining supply flow to Russia worth the losses being incurred? Churchill and Roosevelt concluded that it was, that the political necessity of supporting Stalin outweighed the material costs. But the decision required conscious acceptance of casualties that might otherwise have been unacceptable. The Arctic convoys continued throughout the war, delivering millions of tons of supplies despite horrific losses in ships and men. The ethical questions raised by the scatter order remain unresolved. Did Pound's duty to preserve British warships justify abandoning merchant ships to near certain destruction? Could any intelligence assessment, however alarming, justify such drastic action without visual confirmation of enemy forces? What obligations do naval officers have to the civilians serving under their protection? These questions admit no easy answers. Military necessity sometimes requires sacrifices that are morally uncomfortable. The challenge is distinguishing genuine necessity from panic, calculated risk from reckless abandonment. The comparison between PQ-17 and other convoy battles of World War II reveals how exceptional the disaster was. Other convoys suffered higher percentage losses. SC-122 and HX-239 in the Atlantic lost 22 ships in 5 days, but those losses occurred through sustained combat against determined enemies. PQ-17's losses resulted from a command decision that removed defenses before combat demanded it. The distinction matters because it speaks to institutional dysfunction rather than tactical defeat. Losing battles to superior force is unfortunate, but comprehensible. Losing battles because of self-inflicted strategic errors is inexcusable. The fate of the 11 merchant ships that did reach Russian ports from PQ-17 deserves recognition. These vessels, through skill, luck, and determination, survived the scatter and completed their missions. Some navigated through fog and ice to avoid detection. Others fought off attacks by gunfire and evasive maneuvering. Several benefited from Soviet air patrols that provided cover during the final approaches to Murmansk. The crews of these ships performed heroically under circumstances that would have justified surrender or flight. They continued toward their destinations when every rational calculation suggested turning back, and they succeeded when success seemed impossible. Admiral Pound died 3 months after PQ-17, his health destroyed by the stress of high command and the brain tumor that had been affecting his judgment for months. Whether he understood the magnitude of his error, whether he regretted the deaths his decision caused, is not recorded. His defenders argue that he made the best decision possible with the information available, that protecting irreplaceable warships from a perceived battleship threat was strategically sound, even if the execution proved disastrous. His critics counter that a commander who panics at unconfirmed intelligence, who abandons merchant ships without cause, who ignores the assessments of officers on scene, has failed in his fundamental duties regardless of his reasoning. The legacy of convoy PQ-17 is preserved in numerous accounts, official histories, personal memoirs, documentary records. The men who sailed in that convoy and survived wrote about their experiences, some immediately after the war, others decades later, when they could finally process the trauma. The ships that were sunk are remembered in maritime casualty lists and war memorials. The cargo that went to the bottom, tanks that might have fought at Kursk, aircraft that might have contested German air superiority, vehicles that might have supported offensives, represents losses that cannot be quantified, but that certainly affected the course of the Eastern Front. The memorial to PQ-17 is not a physical monument, but the collective memory of what happens when command decisions prioritize fear over judgment, when theoretical threats override operational reality, when the men at risk are left to die because those commanding them saw dangers that did not exist. Every subsequent convoy commander who maintained escorts despite intelligence warnings, who fought through attacks rather than scatter, who trusted the professional judgment of officers on scene, was implementing lessons paid for by the men of PQ-17. The price of those lessons was 153 lives and 24 ships, a cost that can be calculated but never truly paid. 35 ships sailed with convoy PQ-17. 24 were sunk. 153 men died. The order that caused this catastrophe consisted of 3 words: convoy is to scatter. Those 3 words, transmitted on the evening of July 4, 1942, transformed an organized formation into a death trap, stripped protection from those who needed it most, and created a disaster that could have been avoided if institutional courage had matched the courage of the men being abandoned. The Arctic Ocean received the ships and men that British leadership sacrificed to avoid a battle that never came. The cold water preserved their memory better than official histories ever would, and the lesson remains, carved in ice and written in the logs of sunken vessels. Fear is more dangerous than the enemy it seeks to avoid.